My name is Claire Emberton. I am 34 years old. And at 7:22 on a Thursday evening, I heard my mother say, Claire is not to speak at the rehearsal dinner. She'll be there, she'll smile, she'll sit at table 9 with the cousins, and if anyone asks what she does, Denise will handle it. To my sister Margot, in the private dining room of the Wexford Club, while they believed I was still in the parking garage looking for my phone, I was not in the parking garage. I was 11 feet from the service entrance, holding a garment bag over my shoulder, and I had walked in through the kitchen hallway because the front entrance was being used for floral deliveries. The kitchen staff hadn't looked twice. They were plating appetizers. I was nobody to them. My mother's voice carried the way it always had, not loud, just certain. The way you speak when you have never once been contradicted in the room you're standing in. And what I heard was not anger or cruelty, or even strategy. It was logistics. I was a line item being managed. My left hand tightened on the garment bag's hanger hook. The wire bit into the crease between my index and middle finger. I did not move. I did not set the bag down. I stood there, and something inside me began doing what it had been trained to do for 13 years, parsing a claim against its source data, running the sentence backward through everything I already knew, looking for the structure beneath the words. My mother had not said, I don't want Claire to embarrass us. She had said, Denise will handle it. Denise Ashmore was the family attorney. Handle what? Handle me? Handle a question about my work? There was one more thing said in that hallway. Margot's voice, lower, almost bored. What about the allocation from the foundation? Is that finalized? My mother said a number. I will come back to that number. First, let me tell you how long this had been happening. I stayed perfectly still for what felt like a very long time after those words. Before I tell you what I decided in that stillness, tell me, what time is it where you are? And have you ever heard something you weren't supposed to hear? Because what you do in the next moment defines everything that follows. I chose to set my garment bag quietly against the wall, walk back out through the kitchen, and drive to my apartment without attending the fitting. I texted my sister, running late, migraine, will be there tomorrow. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji. No follow-up, no concern. I need you to understand what I do for a living before the rest of this makes sense. I am a forensic grant auditor. I work for a nonprofit compliance firm that reviews how charitable foundations distribute funds, whether the money that was promised to specific programs actually arrived at those programs, whether the documentation matches the disbursement, whether the overhead allocations are honest or inflated. I have spent 13 years reading grant applications, tax filings, board minutes, and distribution ledgers. My entire career is built on a single skill: noticing when the numbers a person presents to the world do not match the numbers hidden in the paperwork. I smell discrepancies the way a sommelier smells cork taint, not because I'm looking for it, but because my nervous system flags it before my conscious mind decides whether to care. That skill had exposed misallocated funds in 17 different organizations across 3 states. It was about to do the same thing to my own family's foundation. The Emberton Family Foundation was established by my grandfather, Philip Emberton, in 1987. It funded music education programs in underserved school districts across the Southeast. When my grandfather died in 2011, control passed to my mother, Judith Emberton, as sole trustee. My sister Margot became co-trustee in 2019, after she married Graham Holt, whose family had contributed a sizable endowment. I was never asked to serve on the board. I was never shown a financial statement. When I asked, once, in 2016, my mother said, "The foundation is in good hands, Claire. You worry about your little audits." She said it while cutting a pear at the kitchen island of the house I grew up in, and she did not look up from the cutting board. Here is what I was to the Emberton family. I was the younger daughter who had not married well, who had not married at all, who lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Durham and drove a 10-year-old Subaru with a dent in the rear quarter panel. Margot had married Graham. Graham's family had a name, a lake house, a venture fund. Margot had produced 2 children and a lifestyle that photographed well. I had produced an expertise that made people uncomfortable at dinner parties. The irony is that I had spent over a decade examining the financial integrity of other people's charitable foundations, whether their stated missions matched their actual disbursements, whether the families behind them were using tax-exempt structures as personal budgets. And not once, not in 13 years, did I turn that lens on the foundation that bore my own last name. I told myself it was a boundary, professional distance, respect for family. What it actually was the one place I had agreed to stop counting. My mother's system was simple and had operated without interruption for as long as I could remember. Margot was the public daughter, the one introduced, the one photographed, the one seated at the main table. I was the private daughter, the one who showed up, who was pleasant, who did not require management as long as I did not ask questions or take up space that had been allocated to someone else. When I graduated summa cum laude from UNC, my mother hosted a dinner for Margot's engagement. When I received my certified fraud examiner credential, my mother asked if I could help coordinate the catering for the foundation's annual gala. Every achievement I earned was either absorbed into Margot's timeline or converted into a task that served the family's public image. The rehearsal dinner was for Margot's vow renewal. She and Graham were recommitting after 7 years, and my mother had turned it into an event that rivaled the original wedding. The Wexford Club, 80 guests, a 12-piece string ensemble. The guest list included local business owners, 2 state legislators, and, I learned later, the CEO of Harwick Strauss Education Partners, a national nonprofit that had recently awarded a significant contract to my firm. The contract I had personally secured by leading the compliance review of their Southeast disbursement programs. My name was on the engagement letter, my methodology was cited in their public report, and my mother did not want me to speak at a dinner where the CEO of that organization would be present. That fact did not register fully until 3 days later. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a foundation's 990 filing when the thought completed itself. My mother knew who was on the guest list. She had approved every name. She knew what I did for a living. And she had specifically instructed Margot to ensure I did not speak about my work in a room where the person most qualified to recognize it would be seated. I spent 3 weeks after that night building what I'm about to show you. But before I do, where are you watching from? Leave it below. I want to know how many rooms this story reaches. The first thing I did was request a copy of the Emberton Family Foundation's most recent publicly available 990 tax filing. Any tax-exempt organization is required to make this available. I downloaded it from the IRS database on a Tuesday morning at 6:15. I printed it on my home printer, sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee that went cold before I touched it, and I started reading. The filing listed total grants distributed, $347,000 for the fiscal year. Program descriptions included music instrument purchases for 12 school districts, teacher training stipends, and an annual scholarship fund. Board members listed: Judith Emberton, Margot Emberton Holt, Denise Ashmore, and Graham Holt. 4 people, no external oversight, no independent audit committee. For a foundation distributing over $300,000 a year, that alone was a flag I would have raised for any client. I circled it and kept reading. The program expense ratio was listed at 81%. That meant 81 cents of every dollar went to actual programs. Reasonable on paper, but the Schedule F, the detailed breakdown of individual grants, told a different story. I cross-referenced each listed recipient school district with the State Education Department's public records of received charitable contributions. Of 12 districts listed, only 7 had records of receiving funds from the Emberton Foundation in the corresponding fiscal year. 5 districts, representing $142,000 in claimed disbursements, showed no record of receiving anything. I sat with that number for a long time. Something in me went very quiet. Not calm, quiet the way a room goes quiet when the furnace shuts off, and you suddenly realize how much noise was always there. $142,000 claimed as disbursed to programs that had no record of receiving it. And that was one fiscal year. The second layer opened when I pulled the prior 3 years of filings. I built a spreadsheet, district by district, year by year, claimed amount versus confirmed receipt. Over 4 fiscal years, the gap was $463,000. Nearly $500,000 listed as program expenses that could not be verified through any independent source. The pattern was consistent. Each year, 2 to 4 fictitious or inflated grants padded the Schedule F, while actual program spending remained flat. Someone was generating documentation for disbursements that never reached their stated recipients. I requested copies of the Foundation's grant award letters, the documents sent to recipient organizations confirming the amounts. I obtained 3 of them through contacts at 2 of the listed school districts, administrators I had worked with on other audits who trusted me enough to pull their files. The letters were on Emberton Foundation letterhead, signed by Judith Emberton, dated appropriately. But the letters sent to the 2 districts I had verified as non-recipients had one difference. The font in the grant amount field was Calibri. Every other document the Foundation had ever produced, every press release, every annual report, every piece of correspondence I had ever seen, used Garamond. My mother was meticulous about that font. She had once returned a printed program because the caterer used the wrong typeface. Calibri is the default font in Microsoft Word. Someone had typed those amounts into a template and not changed the font to match. It was the kind of error only someone who had spent years examining documents side by side would catch. And it meant those letters had not been prepared by my mother's usual process. They had been created separately, by someone less careful, for a purpose that required them to exist on paper but never arrive at an actual school. I pulled the metadata on the digital versions of 2 of those letters, obtained through a public records request to one of the districts that had received them as attachments. The author field in the document properties read, M. Holt Wexford, Margot's married name. The device name was Graham Surface, created on dates that fell within 2 weeks of each year's filing deadline. Then I found something else. I requested the Foundation's bank statements through a channel I will describe only as lawful and available to any family member with standing interest in a family trust. The operating account showed regular outgoing transfers labeled Program Disbursement, matching the inflated amounts on the 990. But the receiving accounts were not school districts. They were routed to a commercial account held by an LLC called Wexford Holdings Group. I called the North Carolina Secretary of State's office. Wexford Holdings Group was registered to Graham Holt. Its business purpose was listed as consulting services. It had no employees, no website, and no public record of any client engagement. $463,000 in charitable funds, claimed as music education grants for children, had been routed through fabricated documentation into a private LLC controlled by my sister's husband. My mother's signature was on every filing. Margot's computer had produced the falsified award letters, and the family attorney, Denise Ashmore, had certified the 990s. The rehearsal dinner was 9 days away. I had not yet decided what I would do, but I was no longer wondering why my mother did not want me to speak. 7 days before the event, I drove to my mother's house to return a serving dish she had lent me for a dinner party 2 months earlier. An errand. Nothing more. My mother's housekeeper, Rosa, let me in through the side door. Rosa had worked for my mother for 19 years. She had watched me grow up. She once drove me to an urgent care clinic when I was 16, and my mother was at a Foundation event. Rosa set the dish in the pantry and said, without looking at me, "Your mother had a meeting here Tuesday. With Denise and Mr. Holt. They were in the study for 2 hours. I brought them coffee twice." The second time, Denise was saying something about moving the account before the fiscal year closed. Rosa did not say anything else. She did not ask me a question. She folded a dish towel, set it on the counter, and walked back toward the laundry room. She had been watching for longer than I knew. At the vow renewal rehearsal dinner, 80 guests filled the Wexford Club's grand dining room. The ceiling was hand-painted. The chandeliers had been imported from a chateau in Burgundy. My mother mentioned this in her welcome remarks, which lasted 11 minutes. Margot and Graham sat at the center table. I sat at table 9, between my cousin Derek and an empty chair that had been assigned to a guest who never arrived. The string ensemble played Dvorak. The wine was a 2018 Chateauneuf du Pape, $42 a bottle, and there were 14 bottles on the table nearest the entrance alone. I ate the salad course. I did not speak to anyone about my work. Denise Ashmore was seated at table 2, closest to my mother. I watched her cut her bread without butter and set her knife down with a precision that meant she was tracking the room. The CEO of Harwick Strauss Education Partners was a woman named Vivian Park. She was seated at table 3. I knew her face from a professional conference in Atlanta 2 years earlier, where I had presented findings on disbursement fraud in mid-sized family foundations. She had asked a question during the Q&A that I remembered because it was the most specific question anyone had ever asked me in public. What is the most common document-level indicator that a foundation is generating phantom grants? I had answered, font inconsistency in amount fields. She had nodded once, written something down, and not spoken to me again. During the main course, Vivian Park stood up from her table, crossed the room, and stopped at table 9. She looked at me for a moment, then said, "Claire Emberton, I've been hoping to meet you again. Your team's compliance methodology on our Southeast review was exceptional. I cited it in our annual board presentation last month." The room shifted. Not loudly. Conversations near us paused the way they pause when something unexpected enters a controlled space. My cousin Derek looked at me. 2 guests at the adjacent table turned slightly. My mother, who had been speaking with a state legislator near the bar, stopped mid-sentence. Margot's voice arrived from the center table, light and practiced. "Claire helps with numbers. She's always been the quiet one." Vivian Park did not acknowledge this. She said, "The Emberton Foundation. That's your family's organization, isn't it? We've been reviewing their grant reporting as part of our regional compliance mapping. There are some questions I'd like to discuss with whoever manages the program disbursements." My mother was already moving toward us. She reached table 9 and said, with the particular warmth she reserved for people she needed to manage, "Vivian, how wonderful that you know our Claire. She does very important work. We're so proud." I set my fork down. My mother said, "This isn't really the evening for shop talk though, is it? Let's save the details for another time." Vivian looked at my mother, then at me. I could see her processing the seating arrangement, the distance between table 9 and the center, my mother's arrival velocity. Vivian Park had spent 20 years in nonprofit oversight. She recognized a management structure when she was standing inside one. I said nothing. Not yet. Margot stood from the center table and approached. "Mom, it's fine. Claire can talk about her little audits if she wants." She smiled at Vivian. "We're very supportive of Claire's career." My mother said, "Of course we are." Graham remained seated, watching from the center table with a glass of wine held at chest height, and an expression I had seen on the faces of people in conference rooms when they realized the auditor had already read the documents they thought were still in the filing cabinet. I stood up. I addressed Vivian. "I'd be happy to discuss the Foundation's disbursement records with your team. I have some observations that may be relevant to your mapping project." Then I turned to my mother. I delivered the only sentence I had planned. Quietly, the way I would state a finding in a report, not as accusation, but as fact. "You didn't ask me to stay silent because you were embarrassed by what I do. You asked me to stay silent because you knew exactly what I would recognize if someone in this room asked me the right question." My mother's mouth opened. Nothing came out for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Claire, this is not the time or place." Graham said, from his seat. "She's always been like this. She makes everything about herself." Denise Ashmore said, "I think we should all take a breath and remember what tonight is about." Margot said, "You're ruining my night. You always do this." 3 resistance tactics, deployed in under 15 seconds. Reframing me as the aggressor. credibility attack, family loyalty appeal. I had watched this pattern operate for 34 years. It was structurally identical to every deflection I had ever documented in an institutional audit. Deny, reframe, redirect. Vivian Park, who had not moved, said calmly, "Actually, I think this is relevant. Miss Emberton, we've flagged the Emberton Foundation in our preliminary review. Specifically, we've identified 5 recipient districts with no corresponding records of receipt over the last 4 fiscal years. I was planning to contact your office Monday." My mother looked at Vivian as though the chandelier had spoken. The room was now listening, not politely, fully. I said nothing further. Vivian had confirmed externally what I had found independently. 2 separate methodologies. Same conclusion. The fiction my mother had built could not survive contact with a second set of records. My mother turned to Denise. Denise was looking at the tablecloth. She did not speak. She had certified those filings. She knew what they contained. And for the first time in the 19 years I had watched her operate as my mother's counsel, she had nothing prepared. Graham set his wineglass down. He said, "Whatever discrepancy exists, it's an accounting error. These things happen in small foundations." He said it with the casual authority of a man who had never once been asked to justify a number. I opened my handbag. I placed a single printed page on table 9, the metadata summary from the falsified grant letters, showing the author field, device name, and creation dates. I did not explain it. I set it down and waited. Graham looked at the page. His face did something I have seen exactly twice in my career. The micro-expression of a person seeing their own name in a document they believed was invisible. I sat back down. The dinner ended 40 minutes early. My mother told departing guests there was a family matter, requiring attention. Margot did not look at me as she left. Graham was on his phone in the coat room, speaking to someone in a voice I could hear but not decipher. Denise Ashmore left through the kitchen entrance, the same hallway where I had stood 11 days earlier, listening. The following Monday, Vivian Park's team formally opened a compliance review of the Emberton Family Foundation. Within 2 weeks, the IRS received a referral from Harwick Strauss flagging potential diversion of charitable assets. The foundation's operating accounts were frozen pending investigation. Graham Holt retained separate counsel. Denise Ashmore resigned as board counsel and, 3 weeks later, sent me a 4-sentence email. It said she had suspected irregularities for 2 years, had raised concerns privately with my mother, had been told the discrepancies were timing differences in grant processing, and had chosen to accept that explanation. She said she was sorry. She did not ask for forgiveness. I did not offer it. 6 weeks after the dinner, my mother called me. Her voice was controlled and flat. She said, "You have destroyed this family's reputation." I said, "The foundation's filings are public record. The reputation was a function of the filings. The filings were false." She hung up. Margot did not call me for 3 months. When she did, she said she had not known the full extent of Graham's involvement. I did not challenge this directly, but I also did not confirm it. I told her I had the metadata from her computer. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I should have asked more questions." That was the truest thing she had said to me in 7 years of marriage to Graham Holt. The State Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation in month 4. Graham's LLC was subpoenaed. Bank records showed $463,000 in diverted funds. In month 7, Graham entered a guilty plea to 1 count of charitable fraud and 1 count of tax evasion. Restitution was ordered. The foundation was dissolved by consent. My mother's name was removed from 2 nonprofit boards she had served on for over a decade. The Wexford Club quietly revoked the family's membership. Margot filed for legal separation in month 5. She moved with her 2 children into a rented townhouse 14 miles from the lake house. I helped her find it. I co-signed the lease. Her children, Ellie 9 and Thomas 6, had been used as props in every foundation photo for 5 years. I made sure the separation agreement included a provision that no images of the children could be used in any foundation-related materials or legal filings. It was a small clause. It mattered. Rosa, my mother's housekeeper, was let go in month 3. My mother said she was downsizing. I called Rosa. I asked if she needed a reference. She said she already had one. From Vivian Park, who had contacted her independently during the review. Rosa had provided a written statement about the Tuesday meetings she had overheard. She had been keeping a notebook. Dates, visitors, fragments of conversation, for 3 years. She said she had started writing things down the year my mother stopped saying please to her. Rosa now works for a family in Raleigh. She sent me a photograph of their garden last spring. I keep it on my refrigerator. Denise Ashmore appeared before the State Bar's Ethics Review Panel in month 9. She was not disbarred, but she received a formal reprimand and a 2-year supervised practice requirement. She sent me a second email, longer than the first. She described the specific moment she had first suspected the disbursement figures were wrong. A board meeting in 2021 where my mother had changed a line item without discussion, and Denise had said nothing. She wrote, "I told myself it was not my foundation. That was the lie I told myself so I could keep signing the documents." Her apology was real. What it could not repair was the 3 years between her suspicion and her silence. There is a thing I postponed for 6 years because the family schedule never had room for it, and my mother always needed me available for foundation events during the same window. A professional certification in forensic accounting, the final credential in my field, requiring 200 hours of supervised case review and a 4-day examination. I enrolled 3 weeks after the dinner. I completed the program in 5 months. The certificate arrived in a brown envelope on a Wednesday afternoon. I opened it at my kitchen table. My name was printed in Garamond, the font my mother insisted on for everything that bore the family name. The irony was so precise it almost felt designed. There is a question I have carried since the night I stood in that kitchen hallway and heard my mother sort me into a category that required management. The question is not why she did it. I understand systems. I understand how families build structures that allocate voice and visibility based on who serves the structure's image and who threatens it. The question is, how long I participated in a system I was professionally trained to dismantle. How many years I walked past the filing cabinet, metaphorically speaking, without pulling the drawer open, not because I couldn't, but because the cost of knowing was a cost I was not yet willing to pay. Silence is never neutral. In every organization I have ever audited, the silence of the competent is more expensive than the noise of the corrupt. Corruption requires someone to act. Silence only requires someone to decide that today is not the day. Enough of those days, stacked together, become a structure, and structures do not announce themselves. They simply stand there, looking permanent, until someone pulls one document and the whole thing shifts on its foundation. The other thing I have learned is smaller and harder. The people who remain silent are not always cowards. Rosa kept a notebook for 3 years. Denise signed documents she suspected were wrong and then could not sleep. Margot asked no questions because the answers would have cost her the life she had arranged around not knowing. Each of them eventually moved. Not heroically, not cleanly, but they moved. And I cannot hold their slowness against them without also holding my own. I was the one with the training. I was the one who could have looked at any time. The difference between me and them is not courage. It is that I finally heard something I could not unhear, and after that, choosing not to look became more expensive than looking. I sat at my kitchen table last Tuesday evening, the same table where I had built the spreadsheet, where I had printed the metadata, where I had opened the brown envelope. It was 7:22, the same time, to the minute, as the evening I had stood in that hallway. I was not thinking about my mother, or Margot, or Graham. I was reviewing a new client's disbursement records, legitimate ones, clean ones. The numbers matched. The fonts were consistent. The grants had arrived. I poured a cup of coffee and it was still warm when I finished. If you have ever been told to stay silent in a room where your own competence was the thing most dangerous to the people giving the order, what did you do with that silence? And if you haven't decided yet, what are you waiting for? This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and dramatic reflection. We hope it reminded you that your dignity is not negotiable, and that setting a boundary, even a painful one, can be an act of love for yourself and everyone the pattern would have reached next.